It's so good to see all of you here this morning. I'm so glad that we get to be together, that we get to spend time worshiping God, that we get to spend time in His Word. And this morning we are, of course, continuing with the Gospel of John, which we've been in for a while now. And you know, the Gospels, and I think John in particular, they're such interesting stories, the way that they're laid out. And we remember, you know, from the very beginning, John is telling a very specific story in a very specific way. And within the book of John itself, we have Jesus encountering people, and those stories are told and communicated in a way that's a little bit different than we see in the other Gospels. And they are these kind of, you know, dramatic, meaningful encounters. And we saw it with Nicodemus, we saw it with the woman at the well, we saw it with the man who was lame, who was healed. And last week we saw it again with the woman who was caught in the act of adultery. On the flip side of that coin, while there are these compelling stories, there is also a lot of talk. And so on one hand, you have Jesus encountering and dramatically changing people's lives, and on the other hand, you have Jesus getting into arguments with people fairly consistently and talking with them in ways that sometimes they can understand, sometimes they can't, talking to them about things they don't want to talk about, bringing up things that they are not comfortable with. And so on one hand, while we have this Jesus who is so loving and empathetic and caring and raises up the weak, we also have a Jesus who directly challenges people in a way that doesn't just change them emotionally or spiritually or physically, but it changes them mentally. They have to start to think about God and about what God is doing in a different way. And you know, the thing about that is that as dramatic as it is that Jesus can make a paralyzed man walk, sometimes we underplay the fact that changing someone's mind is actually potentially more dramatic than that. You know what I'm saying? Especially when those people have lived their lives with a particular understanding of how God and the world work. Particularly when they have been raised by their parents and they have raised their families to believe in this God, the God that they see in the law, the God that they see in the Word, and all of these things, and there is Jesus in front of them, challenging them. And of course, I've mentioned this several times. Sometimes when we read these stories, it's like, well, come on, dude, it's Jesus. Like, listen to Jesus. If you're going to listen to anyone, listen to Jesus. But we don't always, I think, appreciate the fact that in some ways the things that Jesus is telling people about God undermines their idea of who God is and how God works and what God does. And so we see Jesus walking around having to explain himself for things that have happened that he's just done. If you remember, he healed the man who was lame by the pool, but he healed them on a Sabbath day. And so he's challenged by them. Who told you, they say to the paralyzed man, the Jewish leaders, who told you to pick up your mat and walk on the Sabbath? Well, it's the guy who made me well. Well, who is that guy? And when we pick up the story here in chapter 7 and the rest of chapter 8, Jesus, to a degree, is still answering for that. That question of why did you heal this guy on the Sabbath is still in the air. And people still have a lot of feelings about it. People still have a lot of questions that they haven't had answered adequately. And we talked a couple of weeks ago that the pattern that John sets up for us is a pattern that looks just like this. So there's an event. Jesus does something. A problem arises in response to that event. People don't like it for whatever reason. There's something wrong with it. Jesus responds to that. People then react to his response, and then Jesus kind of ties everything up in a way that doesn't really solve anything, right? And we see that over and over again. And maybe we'll circle back later and ask ourselves, why don't Jesus' conclusions tie things up? Because isn't that how we like our stories to go? That he encounters someone and he tells them the truth of God, and they hear the truth of God, and then they change. And that's how it's supposed to go when Jesus walks and talks on this world. Well, here's something that's different about chapters 7 and 8. This pattern I said John established for you is not held up in chapters 7, 8, and 9. Because that's what I like to do. I like to tell you something is one way and then say it's not. So I'm like Jesus in that way, I guess. Because what happens in these chapters is Jesus doesn't need an inciting event to cause trouble. He's already carrying around what's happened before. And he's still answering, as I said, for healing the man on the Sabbath. And then in these chapters, we're going to see he uses his mouth to cause the inciting event. Through talking, through what he's sharing and what he's saying. And instead of the miracle coming at the front and leading to everything, the miracle comes at the end, which is in John chapter 9, which we will look at next week. One of my favorite chapters in the Bible. In fact, the first sermon I ever preached was on John chapter 9. And I think I preached longer that day than I have for you ever. So I'm slowly So in these chapters, if you want to open up your Bibles to chapters 7 and 8, we have a lot of dialogue between Jesus and the leaders in the crowd. And Jesus is, we're going to see, he's communicating them in a way that is difficult for them to understand. And they get fixated on things, and Jesus keeps, talking and teaching. And there's this weird thing that happens where Jesus, though he is kind of confusing people to a degree, he is still speaking so well that people are amazed. They've never heard anyone talk like this before, even though he's not answering all their questions. So let me set the scene for you a little bit. Chapter 7 starts out with Jesus going to the Feast of Tabernacles. So what is the Feast of Tabernacles? The Feast of Tabernacles is the seventh and final annual feast for the Jewish people that they I can't think of words very well this morning, that they celebrated each year. Celebrate is good enough. It wasn't the word I was looking for, but it's good enough. And this was the feast to celebrate the final fall harvest. So they would sacrifice some of what God has given them. They would pray that God would bless them in the next year. And what they would do is they would build these booth-like structures. They would come to Jerusalem, build these booth-like structures, and they would live in them during the time of the festival as a reminder of the temporary dwellings that were a way of life while they wandered in the wilderness. And everyone who was able in Israel, again, would go to Jerusalem, and the temple worship for the holiday included things like a ritual pouring of water from a special pool, the Pool of Siloam, which was symbolic of prayers for the winter rains. So again, you're bringing in things to God, thanking him for what he's done, and you're asking him to bless you the next year. Why do we need to know this? Well, we need to know this because it was a big deal. It was another thing that people went to in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem would have been packed during the time of chapters 7 and 8. And so Jesus is hanging out with his brothers at the beginning of chapter 7, and they tell him that he should go to the festival and make an appearance, do his Jesus thing there. And Jesus says, no, I don't want to do that. It's not my time. But then he gives them this one phrase here in chapter 7. He says, "The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify that its works are evil." Now, this is to a degree a thesis statement for chapter 7 and 8. Because what we're going to see is that things do not go smoothly. Things do not go well as we would think they should go well. And he says exactly what's going to happen when he gets more attention. What's going to happen? The world is going to hate him. Why? Because he knows the difference between good and evil. And the world is evil. So his brothers left. Jesus says, "I'm not going, you go." So they left, and then Jesus secretly went after them. And when he gets into the city, people are looking for him. Everyone's wondering where Jesus is. And some were saying good things about him, like, "Hey, he's a good man." And other people were saying, "No, I really think he's deceiving everyone." So this is just kind of the buzz that's going around. He's a good guy. No, he's a liar. Okay? And he's the Son of God. No, he's demon-possessed. We might circle back around to that one again later as well. Seems like an odd thing to say, right? But the reason why they say it, we'll just talk about it right now, is people are seeing him, hearing him speak with power, are seeing him doing miracles, and he's saying he's the Son of God. And if you don't believe he's the Son of God, then where is he getting his power from? And if it's not from God, then where is it from? He's demon-possessed. That's how because demons love to go around and heal blind people and make the lame walk again and do all those sorts of things. They're known for it. So as we go through these different exchanges, I want us to pay attention to a couple of things. We're just going to look at like 4 or 5 highlights here. Number 1, what did Jesus actually say? So what are the words that came out of his mouth? 2, what did it mean to his audience? Did the setting or their history or different things, did that color how they were going to hear what Jesus say? And then finally, what was the response to those words? So Jesus is there. He's in Jerusalem. He stays undercover until about halfway through the festival, and he gets up and starts to teach in the temple. So let's pick it up in John chapter 7, verses 15 through 24. He's teaching. The Jews there were amazed and asked, "How did this man get such learning without having been taught?" Jesus answered. And what they mean by that is he's not a Pharisee, so he didn't go through all those extra years of education that qualified a Pharisee to teach and be authoritative about the things of God. Jesus answered, "My teaching is not my own. It comes from the one who sent me. Anyone who chooses to do the will of God will find out whether my teaching comes from God or whether I speak on my own. Whoever speaks on their own does so to gain personal glory, but he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is a man of truth. There is nothing false about him. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet not one of you keeps the law. Why are you trying to kill me?" "You are demon-possessed," the crowd answered. "Who is trying to kill you? Is anyone else confused?" Is the conversation making a lot of sense? Not totally, right? It's not totally making sense. Jesus said to them, "I did one miracle and you are all amazed. Yet because Moses gave you circumcision, though actually it did not come from Moses but from the patriarchs, you circumcise a boy on the Sabbath. Now if a boy can be circumcised on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses may not be broken, why are you angry with me for healing a man's whole body on the Sabbath? Stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly." Maybe we can ask this prefacing question. What is this conversation even about? Right? I mean, it's a fair question. He stood up in the temple, he's preaching, everyone is impressed, and then it kind of goes down this weird rabbit hole that is a little bit hard to follow. So what did he actually say? Well, there's a lot. that he said here in these statements. The people were amazed because, he's Jesus. But his response, the thing he wants them to know, is that he wants them to know, I'm not amazing because I'm amazing. I'm amazing because of who sent me here and who gave me these words. These words do not come from me, they come from God. Now, he says, I can stand in front of you and I can tell you that I'm amazing. And this message comes from me. But I'm not going to tell you that because that's not the truth. The truth is this message comes from God. And here's the real kicker. If you're having trouble deciding whether this message is from me and therefore potentially false, or if it's from God, there's one way you can figure out. You know what it is? If you love God and are close to Him, then you'll know. Is that a helpful answer? Not totally, right? It's not totally a hopeful answer. But what does it effectively do to the people? It puts them in a difficult position. So after this, Jesus kind of decides to go straight for the jugular. He lays this foundation. Hey, you'll get where I'm at if you are with God. But then he says, you know what, though? You're not really fit to decide whether I'm from God or not. Why? Because Moses gave you the law, and what did you do with the law? You didn't follow it. So, who are you to sit there and debate over whether I'm the real deal or not? Do you think you're qualified for that? Furthermore, you circumcise children on the Sabbath. It's a normal rite of passage, but you do it on a day where you are not supposed to work. And you're mad at me for healing a lame man on the Sabbath. So, doesn't that kind of prove that you're not a good judge of what should and shouldn't happen? Now, here's why this is a powerful example. The male children of the Jews were to be circumcised a certain number of days after they were born. And here's Jesus' point. You make sure those kids are circumcised even if it's on the Sabbath. And you call that following the law. Well, how is that following the law when healing someone and changing their life is much more important? Okay, so what did they hear? If we had to imagine what they heard through all of this, what did they hear? Well, I would imagine that they probably heard some insulting things. He boldly stated that they did not meet the criteria to say what is from God and what isn't. And it's hard to accept how inflammatory that is when the people that he's speaking to believe that is their God-given responsibility, is to say what is from God and what isn't. And that whole thing about you didn't even follow the law of Moses, right? That's a serious statement. And their response to all of this is, well, clearly you are demon-possessed. Where did this even come from, this idea? Well, from here the crowd wondered, because they knew after the healing of the guy on the Sabbath that the religious leaders wanted to arrest Jesus. They ultimately wanted to get him out of the way. And so they know this is happening, and here's Jesus standing from this crowd, and he's mixing things up, and so they start talking amongst themselves. Isn't this the guy they want to arrest? Well, why aren't they arresting him? Here he is. So the leaders there got wind of this, and they sent some of their soldiers to arrest him. And we find out later that the soldiers decided not to arrest him. Do you know why? Because no one has ever talked like this guy. Ever. And so they decided to defy orders and go back and say, not today. Not today. Let's pick it up in verses 37 through 44. On the last and greatest day of the festival, this is the day where they would pour out the water for blessing over the next year. Get this, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." By this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were later to receive. Up to that time, the Spirit had not been given, since Jesus had not yet been glorified. On hearing his words, some of the people said, "Surely this man is the prophet." Others said, "He is the Messiah." Still others said, "How can the Messiah come from Galilee? Does not Scripture say that the Messiah will come from David's descendants and from Bethlehem, the town where David lived?" Thus the people were divided because of Jesus. Some wanted to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him. Okay, what did he say? Do you see what he just did? Do you see it? The temple worship for that day included the ritual pouring of water from the pools of Siloam, symbolic of prayers for winter rains. This is saying, "God, will you refresh our land and help things grow?" And Jesus stands up and says, "If any of you are thirsty, come to me and drink. And rivers of life will flow through you." Now, Jesus, in saying this, has effectively taken something that they have observed for generations and made it about what? Himself. And there is something beautiful about the comparison of God refreshing the world and bringing new life, and Jesus being here to refresh and to bring life. And Jesus says, "I am here to be the water that brings life. Come to me and drink." What did they hear? Well, it would have been impossible for them to miss that connection. So let's just accept that right off the bat. They had to see what was going on here. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Well, at the very least, we know it caused confusion. Because people hear this and they see him speak with power, and they come out of this saying, "Dude must be a prophet." No, he's not a prophet. I think he's the Messiah. And still others have these ideas about him. And we threw out before, maybe he's demon-possessed and that's where this is coming from. And these people at this time say, but wait a second. How can he be a prophet? And how can he be the Messiah if he's from Galilee? Because isn't the Messiah supposed to be from Bethlehem? And if he's not from Bethlehem, then how can he be who he's supposed to be? Have you ever had a friend who loved technicalities? Right? You know what I'm talking about? And you would get into a discussion with them, and maybe it would become lively, and at some point you were expecting them to follow the rational course of your discussion, but they can't because of a technicality. Well, technically, this can't be blah, 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 right? That's all I hear after they say, well, technically. I just hear blah, 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 blah. So this is here what's happening. People are starting to move towards, well, isn't he this or this? I don't think so. He's not from the right place. So, he can't be that. And some, at this point, wanted to seize him, with the implication being, at the very least, they were going to take him to the rulers to be arrested, or maybe there's even the implication of violence here. To seize someone is not, to me, doesn't sound like a peaceful act. but no one laid a hand on him. Let's jump over to John chapter 8, verses 12 through 20, because things continue. When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." The Pharisees challenged him. "Here you are, appearing as your own witness. Your testimony is not valid." It's one of those questions of like, oh, sure, you say that. So what? Jesus answered, "Even if I testify on my behalf, my testimony is valid, for I know where I came from and where I am going. But you have no idea where I come from or where I'm going. You judge by human standards. I pass judgment on no one, but if I do judge," that's a funny statement, isn't it? "But if I do judge, my decisions are true, because I am not alone. I stand with the Father who sent me. In your own law, it is written that the testimony of two witnesses is true. I am one who testifies for myself. The other witness is the Father who sent me." Then they asked him, "Well, where is your Father?" "You do not know me or my Father." That's kind of clear, isn't it, that they don't know him? "You don't know me or my Father," Jesus replied. "If you knew me, you would know my Father also." He spoke these words while teaching in the temple courts near the place where the offerings were put. Yet no one seized him because his hour had not yet come. Are you catching on to a pattern? Yes. But get what he said earlier. Remember, he said, if you want to know if I'm valid or not, then know God, and your knowledge and relationship with God will tell you that I'm true. What does he say here? If you want to know God, then come get to know me. And that's how you're going to get to know God. But there is a theme that is repeated here. That is an important theme for the book of John. It's so important, it happens at the very beginning of the book, from verses 1 through 13. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a what? A witness, to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to the world was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become," are you ready? "Children of God." Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. Guess what? When John wrote these words, he wasn't lying. And I know we know that, but don't we see this exact thing playing out over and over again in his interactions with people? It kind of explains the backstory to all of this. Jesus is the light of the world. The light shines in the world and will not be overcome by the darkness, because darkness cannot overcome the light. And he came to the world, but the world did not recognize him. Maybe he's a prophet. Maybe he's the Messiah. Maybe he's demon-possessed. But isn't he from Galilee? They don't, and I love this word, they don't recognize him, because you see the implication is they should. They should. As much as we talk about these conversations and how confusing it is, we have to remember and appreciate that these, in fact, are the people of God. That God loves them, and they love God. And if everything went to plan, Jesus would show up on the scene, and they would know him for what he is. But they don't. So what did they hear, going back to our passage, John 8, 12 through 20? What did they hear him say? And if I had to put myself in their position, I'm pretty sure I would have heard Jesus say that he is equal to God, and my brain would have shut off at that point. Fair? I mean, that's kind of the defining moment of this. As much as we love the light of the world talk, when he says, if you want to know God, you have to come to know me, it's a huge statement. And what he says here, these things are hard to ignore. Because the thing about these statements, and Jesus makes them on purpose, is it pushes the hearer to the brink. All right? If you are going to follow Jesus, if you are going to believe in him, then you have to accept what he says. And he doesn't just say, God loves the world. He says a lot of other things that are challenging and hard to accept. And he pushes people to the limits of their understanding because there is no wiggle room in these statements. Think about that statement. If you want to know if I'm true or not, then know God. How do you answer that? There's only two answers, right? Well, I do know God and you're not him. Or, you are reminding me of God. Like there are not so many options, are there, when Jesus says these kinds of things. And if you believe him for these people that are there to worship and honor God, if you believe him, you are essentially saying, you know what, we might have had this wrong for a long, long time. Jesus is the truth, and your experience or your understanding or whatever it is, they pale in comparison to what he is saying and how he is communicating what God is. But if you don't believe him, it is not so hard to call him a blasphemer, one who blasphemes, and to say conclusively, he is lying about God. It could go either way, right? And it does, over and over and over again. And then Jesus steps it up a notch by telling them in verses 31 through 47 that though they are children of Abraham, they don't really act like it. And then he gets into this whole discussion with them about, well, of course we're Abraham's children, and we're not illegitimate and all this thing. Which takes us back again to chapter 1, where he says what's going to change is that he will make people into children of who? God. Not children of Abraham, not children of Moses, not children of the law. Jesus has come to make them children of whom? God. So he questions their heritage. Is this who you think you are? They will not be children of Abraham or Moses, which is great, of course. We think it's great. But can all of these people understand the difference between being a child of God and being a child of Abraham? That's a tough one, right? We understand it because we were not children of Abraham. And Jesus made us children of God. It makes perfect sense to us. But to them, there might not be such a huge difference. But Jesus is trying to tell them there is a difference between what God is doing with me now and what God has done before. And their response to all of this is arguing and confusion. Which leads us to the last section. Chapter 8, verses 48 through 59. The Jews answered him, aren't we right in saying that you are Samaritan and demon-possessed? Can we all agree that Jesus could have just said no and left the conversation? I am not possessed by a demon, said Jesus, but I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. I am not seeking glory for myself, but there is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Very truly I tell you, whoever obeys my word will never see death. At this they exclaimed, now we know you are demon-possessed. Abraham died, and so did the prophets. Yet you say that whoever obeys your word will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham? He died, and so did the prophets. Who do you think you are? Hasn't he told them over and over again who he thinks? Okay. Jesus replied, if I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me. Though you do not know him, I know him. If I said I did not, I would be a liar like you. But I do know him, and I obey his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. You're not even 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham? It's like hitting your head against a wall over and over again, isn't it? Very truly, I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. At this, they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. Okay. What did Jesus say? Number one, he says again, it's not me who's doing this. It is God. I am not here to bring glory to myself. I am here to bring glory to God. That's what's happening here. It's not about me, it's about him. And if you believe in me, you will not see death. What? What do you mean you won't see death? And then we can't really pass up 55 again. Though you do not know him, I know him. If I said I did not, I would be a liar like you. It's pretty good stuff there. And the capstone, the one that just puts everything together, happens in verse 59, or 58 rather. Very truly I tell you, before Abraham was born, I am. What did they hear? Well, they heard a lot of things, and none of it they understood. Clearly, they're not tracking with what Jesus is saying, and we know that because they got stuck on a technicality again. He's talking about understanding Abraham and Abraham's relationship with God and what Abraham was looking forward to, and they say, you weren't alive when Abraham was here? How do you know that? Are you saying you know Abraham? Good job, great. And they got stuck on this whole death thing too, which understandably so. What do you mean you bring life and that someone won't die? Abraham died, all the prophets died. Again, the implication of those questions, those statements is, are you saying you're better than them? And yes, that's exactly what he's saying. And furthermore, he points out to them again, and if Abraham were here, he would be on my side and not yours. All of these are fighting words capped off again by when he calls himself, I am. Which is, of course, reminiscent of Moses receiving the name of God. And when he says this, what do they decide to do? We are going to stone this dude right here and now because he has taken the proper name of God. And that we cannot stand for. So their response, well, you're demon possessed. Again, the obsession with demons. But with that final statement, they were ready to kill him, and Jesus slipped away. Okay, friends. What does all of this leave us with? A couple things I want us to consider as we close up today. Jesus said at the beginning of this remember back at the beginning of chapter 7, remember what he said. The world will hate me because I know that the world is evil. Now, let's dig into this just a little bit, just a little bite-sized piece. Is Jesus saying that these Jewish leaders and those who were there to worship God, is he saying that they are evil? No. Okay, I want to clear that up. He is not saying that they are evil. However, what do we see happen again and again and again in the story? They cannot see the light. They can't. There is something clouding their vision. at all times. And some of it is their own fault. Isn't he from Galilee? Like, what do you mean life after death? How do you know Abraham? Some of it's their fault because they can't track with Jesus at all. But the thing that we have, and we pointed this out multiple times throughout this study, the things that Jesus told them were hard to understand. And as much as we may sit here and point fingers at them, we probably would have responded the same way to some of these statements. What do you mean people won't die? Everybody dies. What do you mean Abraham wanted this? You weren't alive when Abraham was here. What do you mean fill in the blank? Over and over and over again. We can say that within the context of these chapters, though, there are people who hate him. I'm not willing to go so far as to say these people are evil again. But there's two categories of people, basically, that do not like him and want him to go away. Number one is the religious leaders, those who have spent their lives and their time honoring God. Why do they want him to go away? Because Jesus challenged their worldview and understanding of God. He's rewriting the books that they have based their lives on. Is he really rewriting it? No. But can they see the difference? No. When we looked at the woman in the well last week, I said this phrase. Wayne asked me about it afterwards. I said Jesus broke the law. I said that on purpose. Now, I want us to look back at that for 1 second. Remember, the woman was brought caught in adultery. Her punishment was to be stoned. That's what it said in the law, and Jesus didn't do it. Okay? Did he follow exactly what the law said? No, he didn't. But what we didn't talk about, well, we did talk about it, but what I want to remind you of is what he did instead. Where the law called for death, he gave what? Life, mercy, grace. And friends, that was the problem that these people really had in the first place. God had become a God of rules, and they loved him, and they did their best to follow him, but they had at some point missed the heart of God. A God who would choose to heal a man who has been lame for 40 years, even on the Sabbath, and never consider that breaking the law. It is a God who is not found in simple do this and don't do that. It is a God who lives with and knows his people and chooses them. Because how many times can I say this? Apparently every week. For God did not send his Son to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. And we are reminded again and again, not just by that, but by those who can accept him because of the otherness of who he is. Look, it is a difficult thing to wrap your mind around the Son of God. It's a big idea. And in order to accept that idea, you have to give up some of the things that make sense to you. You have to accept that the world can work in a different way. One of the biggest things that non-believers get caught up on is the resurrection of Jesus. Do you know why? Because it's impossible. People do not come back from death. But if you believe in Jesus, what you say is you're right. It is impossible, but it is not impossible for God. That takes us out of the world we live in and know and understand and says, maybe we don't know all of it. Maybe we don't understand. But when we try to put God into this place where we understand him and know him, we rob him of what makes him who he is. Because, friends, I want a God who is fully capable of breaking and rewriting every law. I don't want one who has to follow what we think is right. But it's hard, really is, to wrap your mind around that. And we are reminded again and again by the encounters in the book of John that believing in Jesus is not a simple exercise of seeing miracles and hearing words and changing the world. Because in order for the world to change, those people have to change. And in order for them to change, the way that they understand everything has to change. And how many of you in this room like change? Right? We don't like little changes. We're talking about world-altering change. Which reminds us of one final thing today. It takes humility to follow Jesus. It takes a willingness to say, I don't know. It takes this great humility to stand up and to declare, there is something more than me and my understanding and my thoughts about how the world works. And it takes great faith. That thing that pushes us beyond what we know to say, Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, here to change the world, to die and to be raised again so that we might have life. And there are many who will hear and believe, and there are many who won't. But this morning, as we close out, as we move to communion, I want us to think about the technicalities we get caught up on. The reasons or excuses we give for God to be what we think he should be. The ways that we hymn him in. And the ways that we declare he can or cannot work in the lives of others. And may we be convicted this morning that when Jesus was here on earth, he worked the way God wanted him to, regardless of what other people thought. And that was for the glory of God. So as we take this bread and we drink this cup, this morning we are celebrating that God did the unthinkable, the impossible. How did God even come up with this? This thing that breaks all the rules. It was out of his great love and mercy, his desire for us to have life with him. So let's remember and celebrate that this morning.